Well, we're here with Labour's finance spokesman David Cunliffe talking about the amendment to the emissions trading scheme and a report that's just come out which looks at the costs of the scheme and what the Select Committee, the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, has found from various submissions from Treasury and others. David, what's come out in this report?
Well, in a nutshell, Bernard, this is the most extraordinary bill we've ever seen. The officials lined up in front of the Select Committee and they told us that the fiscal cost of this climate change bill would more than double from $50 billion to $110 billion by 2050. So their mistake was $12,000 per man, woman and child in New Zealand by that time, or $24,000 for all of us to pay.
Did they say what the mistake was?
Yes, they'd forgot to build in the mid-range carbon price of $50 a tonne and had been working off $25 a tonne, which is already out of date. And they forgot to put the compounding effect in on the year-by-year accumulation.
So what does this mean for New Zealand's debt if this bill goes ahead and we actually get what you end up with, $110 billion in extra debt?
Well, the revised estimate is an addition to New Zealand's net debt of 14 to 17% of GDP. And is that a lot? Well, remembering that at the end of the last government we'd got net debt to 0 and gross debt to 17, that's essentially overnight doubling what we had.
So what does that mean then for generations X and Y who will be working in 20, 30 years' time to pay off this debt?
Well, I think it's an impossible situation, frankly. It's impossible because you're adding now onto a problem that already existed with our young people having to pay for the superannuation debt that this government says it can't afford to pre-fund. That and, of course, the lockout from the housing market that we all know is occurring because we refuse to have a rational tax system. And then you add on to that the fact that we've just imposed this huge, massive, enormous debt on our young people. Why? Because we're cutting so many brakes for big polluters. We're essentially paying them to keep polluting.
What would you do then, given that the emissions trading scheme is apparently being driven through by the national government? What would you do if you were in government?
Well, the first thing to say is that there was a much better emissions trading system in place before this amendment bill went through. Fiscal cost much lower, much more effective at mitigating emissions, much better at structuring up the incentives for industry to help improve New Zealand's position. So this amendment bill is a giant step backwards. Now, was our previous bill perfect? Well, I imagine that improvements can be made, and we've got open ears and we want to work with the community and stakeholders to see what can be done better in future. But the key thing is, for the government, look, you're in a hole, stop digging. Stop this bill now. This is insanity. Even the Treasury said that the level of analysis that lay behind these huge numbers was so flimsy that it was not appropriate for a bill of this magnitude. That's the New Zealand Treasury criticising its own government for plucking numbers out of the air. How bad was the plucking? Well, it was out by a factor of 2. I've never seen anything like it.
But this is the same Treasury that no doubt gave advice before the original emissions trading scheme. Should we abandon the whole thing altogether, given that the Copenhagen conference in a month or two's time appears to be now nothing more than a talk shop?
Well, it would be lovely to abandon global warming if it didn't exist, but given that there's a 99% probability that it does, and that if unchecked it could threaten human life itself on this planet, we unfortunately don't have the luxury of putting our head in the sands. The question is, how can we achieve an adequate level of emission reduction so that New Zealand can play a constructive part in the world, as we believe we stand for, at the lowest economic cost and ultimately at the lowest personal cost.
But isn't this the problem you have with any emissions trading scheme, that you essentially create a vehicle for lobbyists and others to jump in, get exemptions and effectively pass the cost on to someone else? Wouldn't a carbon tax be much better?
Well, a carbon tax has some attractions. It's simple and it cuts across sectors. But you'll recall the furore about the so-called fart tax going back a few years ago. It's likely to be highly resisted as well. What the economists tell us is that the most efficient vehicle is probably a well-structured cap and trade scheme alongside other complementary measures, like, for example, using some of the fiscal proceeds of that to incentivise new environmental technology and emission-saving measures. Now, with a good virtuous circle, we can certainly lower the cost to New Zealanders. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this kind of fiscal insanity and plucking numbers out of the air.
David Cunliffe, thank you very much.